She was tried as a witch and found guilty. Her father dragged her to the cliffside as was the custom in that people, and her brothers cast her down over the cliffs. She bounced off the rocks, she fell into the crashing water, and the tide dragged her out over the coral to where the fishes came out from dark places and nibbled flesh from her bones, and she danced in the wild currents at the ocean's depth until at last she came to rest on a bed of sand. There was a fisherman from a land way off to the west who was out one day, maybe into deeper waters than he should, but it was a wonderful clear day, and he lay on his back looking up at the perfect blue sky. The waves lapped against the side of his boat. His nets were deep, and it seemed as if time wasn't even passing for him, until at last he stretched himself out, and he reached to pull up his nets, and they were heavy. This was a good catch. He had to turn away from the side of the boat and haul over his shoulder, which meant that he didn't see her one bony hand come up over the side of the boat, the fingers locking on another bony hand, all about with nets, and the dome of her white skull grinning over the edge. It felt strange not to feel the splashing of fish. So he turned to look, and he saw her half in and half out of the boat, and he grabbed at one of his oars and he beat at the dome of her skull until she was driven off the side of the boat, and he paddled as hard as he could for land, and when he got to land he jumped out of the boat, he grabbed his nets and he ran up the beach to his hut. He dragged himself in. The sun was going down, it was dark, there were no windows in this little hut, he didn't stay here very often. He sat in the corner of the room in the dark. He shivered. But eventually he calmed down. He felt a surge of relief, realising that he was all right. He wrapped himself up in a blanket and he fell fast asleep. And he would not have slept so soundly if he'd known that she had still been caught up in his nets as he'd paddled his way across the ocean. If he'd known that she'd been bouncing along the stony beach behind him as he ran up to the hut. If he'd known that even now she was lying in the corner of his room, all wrapped up in nets and seaweed, waiting. His breathing slowed as he drifted deeper into sleep. She unwound the netting, and she creaked as she stood up. She moved over towards him. She pulled aside the blankets that he'd wrapped himself in. She pulled aside the seal skins that he was wearing. She reached for his chest and she pulled aside the skin over his breastbone. She pulled aside the muscles. She knitted apart his ribs. She reached in and pulled out his still beating heart. And holding it aloft, she moved herself to the centre of the room, where she began to beat upon his heart like a drum. And as she beat upon that drum, she began to dance, a wild and twisting dance that spun her all around. And as she danced and as she beat, she began to chant. She called for flesh to return to her bones, and as she sang, like worms it crawled out of her bones all over her. She called for skin to form over that flesh, and as she did, pale white skin wrapped itself around her. She called for eyes. She called for redness to her lips, for blood to fill her veins. She called for hair to grow out from her head, until she stopped, ceased her dance, ceased the beating on the drum, and was still. And all the hut was silent, save for the beating of the heart in her hand. Smiling, she moved back to where the fisherman was lying. She placed the heart inside his chest. She folded back in the bones of his ribs, pulled back over the muscle of his breast, folded the skin and sealed it closed, wrapped him once again in his sealskins, and just before she pulled the blanket over him, she slipped herself in there beside him. And that is how they woke up the next morning and every morning thereafter for the rest of their lives. Thank you.